During the early 20th century, there was a great debate among anarchists about the direction they should take their organizing. After suffering a treacherous Red Wedding-esque betrayal and brutal defeat to the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War, several proposals were expressed as a form of self-reflection to improve their strategy moving forward. Nestor Machno, the former leader of the anarchist Black Army, along with several other exiled anarchists, proposed that one of the main factors that led to the loss of the war was a lack in political and ideological unity. He believed that anarchists could form tighter, more strategic, and better organized groups if all of the members agreed to follow a strict set of anarcho-communist ideals and strategy. The theory was that a broader-based coalition would attract a less dedicated following that would be more likely to form splinter groups or indulge in spontaneous random action that were more or less unuseful to the cause. He believed that all anarchist militants should band together under a single set of unifying principles, or a platform, giving this idea the name platformism. The name itself deriving from the 1926 organizational platform of the General Union of Anarchists, which was a draft and has been modified by many modern anarchist groups. Now, for a full understanding and at least context for what Nestor Machno was proposing, we're going to go through a few of the points brought up by the platform and see what the anarchists at the time thought of what was being proposed. Now, this video is going to be very theory-heavy and use a few old-timey terms, so this isn't necessarily going to be a 101 style video and will require a little bit of understanding about anarchist ideas and principles moving forward. With all that being said, let's get into it. The platform itself outlined how anarchists should unite in something known as the General Anarchists Union, under four main organizational principles: unity of theory, unity of tactics, collective responsibility, and federalism. The original 1926 platform states: 1. Unity of theory. Theory is the force which guides the activity of individual people and individual organizations along a specific route toward a specific goal. Naturally, it must be shared by all persons and all organizations who join the General Union. The activity of the General Anarchist Union, both in general and in detail, must be perfectly consistent with the theoretical principles professed by the Union. So basically he's saying that all anarchists should join an anarchist union, and that union should follow strict anarchist communist principles, as well as every member of that union should, in turn, also follow those same strict anarcho-communist principles. Number 2, unity of tactics or the collective method of action. The tactical methods employed by the individual members or groups within the union must likewise be united, strictly consistent with one another as well as with the overall theory and tactics of the union. Sharing a general, common tactical line with the movement is of crucial importance for the existence of the organization and the entire movement. It rids the movement of the confusion arising from the existence of multiple mutually antagonistic tactics and focuses all of the movement's forces on a common direction leading to a specific objective. So basically, every anarchist action that happens in the union or by anarchists from the union should follow by the same unified anarchist tactics. So far, so good. 3. Collective responsibility. The practice of operating on one's individual responsibility must be strictly condemned and rejected within the ranks of the anarchist movement. The areas of revolutionary, social, and political life are profoundly collective in nature. Revolutionary public activity in those areas cannot be based upon the individual responsibility of single militants. The general anarchist movement's executive body, the Anarchist Union, takes a decisive stand against the tactic of unaccountable individualism and introduces the principle of collective responsibility into its ranks. The Union as a whole is answerable for the revolutionary and political activity of each member of the Union. Likewise, each of its members is answerable for the revolutionary and political activity of the Union as a whole. So basically, no spontaneous action, and everything you do as an individual anarchist is reflective of the anarchist union, and everything the union does is reflective of the individuals. And finally, 4, federalism. Now I'm going to skip down a little bit to save some time, but it says, federalism means the free agreement of individuals and entire organizations upon collective endeavor, in order to achieve a common objective. Now, any such agreement and any federative union based therein can only become a reality, rather than exist only on paper, if the essential condition is fulfilled that all parties to the agreement and the union fully honor the obligations they take on and abide by the decisions reached jointly. In any social project, however great the federalist basis on which it is built, there can be no rights without responsibilities, just as there can be no decisions without these being implemented. The federalist type of anarchist organization, while acknowledging the right of every member of the organization to independence, freedom of opinion, personal initiative, and individual liberty, entrusts each member with specific organizational duties, requiring that these be duly performed and that the decisions jointly made also be put into effect. Only in this way will the federalist principle come to life and the anarchist organization function properly and move towards the goals it has set. So, the way that I read this, it's basically saying that for a cohesive anarchist society to function, there are both rights and responsibilities. You have the right to independence, freedom of opinion, personal initiative, and individual liberty. But if the people are all starving and we need to help out on the farm once in a while to grow food, then it's our responsibility to do so. Like as it was stated above, there can be no rights without responsibilities, just as there cannot be decisions without these being implemented. Now, obviously I'm giving this a very charitable reading, as there is a lot of authoritarian language being used within this platform. But considering that Machno was a military general, essentially, I tend to lean on the side that he was using this sort of language because he was looking at this from more of a militaristic perspective. But, as you'll soon see, most anarchists at the time didn't quite give such charitability to the platform. You can be sure that since we're talking about anarchists here, there were a lot of differing opinions. Conversely, many anarchists at the time seen this idea as more or less authoritarian, believing that showing any deference to any kind of authority, even one that's respected and agreed upon, would infringe upon their freedom and full autonomy as individuals. Also, strictly focusing on anarcho-communists was seen as detrimental to coalition building. Now, it's important to note that not all of the criticism of the platform was coming from a place of ideological purity. Some of this was from some fairly substantial misunderstandings, and perhaps a bad choice of language on the part of Machno. Machno and Malatesta had several long correspondence about the points raised within the platform, based around the ideas of how leadership functions, as well as theoretical and tactical unity and collective responsibility. Malatesta and others didn't appreciate some of the language used within the platform in regards to executive secretariats guiding the organization, one of the points that were raised that I didn't quote, stating that either you provide leadership by advice and example, leaving people themselves to adopt our methods and solutions if they are or seem to be better than those suggested and carried out by others, or you can direct by taking over command, that is, by becoming a government. Malatesta asked the platformists, in what manner do you wish to direct? The fear was that Machno was essentially Bolshevizing anarchism, installing a centralized vanguard party that would dictate to the union members how to act. But, like I said above, this was more or less due to poor wording within the platform. Machno's intent was never to authoritatively dictate to the workers as a ruler or a commander, but rather to make anarchism the leading idea, or a leadership of ideas as it's sometimes put. But he also realized that something like this would not happen spontaneously, and we would have to work for it. Through education and praxis, the goal was to convince people that anarchism was not just a good idea, but the best possible solution moving forward. The other issue that Malatesta brought up was with the term collective responsibility. The idea that no anarchists act on their own and all members of the union are responsible for the actions performed by the union or its members. There was a fear that this sort of idea would lead to a bureaucratically slow nightmare that would force all anarchists to check in with the General Union to find out if their actions were okay or not. Essentially, this idea would paralyze the movement. It would also eliminate the principles of federalism, as every individual community would be unable to act autonomously and make decisions that would benefit them, but might be out of the purview of the General Union. In other words, it neglects to consider different material conditions. But again, this kind of falls down to clumsy wording within the program. In practice, platformist unions have no issue with adjusting the platform to suit any place that it is proposed, so long as those organizations do not go against some of the core tenets and beliefs. And through more correspondence and finally coming to a certain understanding, Malatesta wrote, "I accept and support the view that anyone who associates and cooperates with the others for a common purpose must feel the need to coordinate his or her actions with those of his or her fellow members, and do nothing that harms the work of others, as well as respect the arguments that have been made. Moreover, I maintain that those who do not feel and do not practice that duty should be thrown out of the association." Perhaps, speaking of collective responsibility, you mean precisely the accord and solidarity that must exist among members of an association. And if that is so, your expression amounts to an incorrect use of language, but basically it would only be an unimportant question of wording, and agreement would soon be reached. Now, that isn't to say that Malatesta fully agreed with the platform. That, of course, is a misconception. He still held fundamental disagreements with ideas such as general secretariats basically running the entire show. Now, whether or not Machno meant that literally, or was figurative in his wording and actually meant something a little bit more bottom-up rather than top-down, is really still left up to question, as the correspondence between Malatesta and Machno ended before they came to a conclusive result on that specific topic. Personally, I believe that a general secretariat isn't necessarily the best way to go, and prefer to have a teams and spokes councils method as a more federal, decentralized organizational tool. But whether or not you agree with every point of the platform, it's clear that this was just a draft, and more clarification of a lot of the things that Machno proposed needed to be questioned. And, luckily, because anarchists are the way they are, we did question it. Or they did. I guess we weren't born yet, but you know what I'm saying. But with all of these clarifications, there was still a question about limiting our organizational scope to purely anarcho-communist principles, while excluding the other elements like syndicalists and mutualists. This was still a major point of contention. For a little bit of context, during the early 20th century, it's important to note that there were three primary schools of thought within the anarchist movement: the anarcho-communists, the anarcho-syndicalists, and the individual anarchists/mutualists. Many prominent anarchists at the time believed that by excluding the individualist anarchists and the syndicalist unions, primarily made up of average working people with little political education, they were disregarding a broad base of people who were dedicated to fighting the system but didn't align perfectly with anarcho-communist principles. Many anarchists wrote a reply to the platform stating, "To maintain that anarchism is only a theory of classes is to limit it to a single viewpoint. Anarchism is more complex and pluralistic, like life itself. The class element is above all its means of fighting for liberation. Its humanitarian character is the ethical aspect, the foundation of society. Its individualism is the goal of mankind." Essentially, they thought that Machno was purity testing. Instead, they proposed a unification of all three primary anarchist adjectives, along with several others, to form something known as synthesis anarchism or anarchism without adjectives. This allowed anarchists and libertarians of all stripes to freely believe what they wanted to believe and seek individual freedom and autonomy while also unifying under the common ideas of anarchism. More or less a broad tent outlook as opposed to Machno's quality over quantity approach. In his text, The Anarchist Synthesis, Sebastian Faure had the view that these currents were not contradictory but complementary, each having a role within anarchism. Anarcho-syndicalism as the strength of the mass organizations and the best way for the practice of anarchism, libertarian communism as the proposed future society based on the distribution of the fruits of labor according to the needs of each one, and anarcho-individualism as a negation of oppression and affirming the individual rights to development of the individual. Notably, American anarchist author Michael Malice coined the expression, "the black flag comes in many colors," to express his support of all schools of anarchism. Basically, anarchism without adjectives tends to imply, as far as economics, a coexistence of economic models from mutualist/individualist anarchism to Bakuninist collectivism and even anarcho-communism. With German anarchist Max Nettlau believing that he might even get bored of doing things under a strictly anarcho-communist economic system, and thought that things should instead be loose and up to the individual's feeling at the time, stating, "But might I not become tired of this, and wish for a spell of relative isolation, of individualism? So I might turn to one of the many possible forms of equal exchange individualism. Perhaps people will do one thing when they are young, and another thing when they grow older. I also think that at the beginning I should adopt communism with friends and individualism with strangers, and shape my future life according to experience. Thus, a free and easy change from one variety of communism to another, thence to a variety of individualism, and so on, would be the most obvious and elementary thing in a really free society. And if any group of people tried to check this, to make one system predominant, they would be bitterly fought as revolutionists fight the present system." Now that's talking about individualists and mutualists, but the syndicalists had a completely different set of ideas. They believed that focusing on anarcho-communism was a great strategy, but you can't be sure that an entire industry will be comprised of perfectly ideologically pure anarchists. Many workers within a union are uneducated in the confusing jargon of economic theory, or even just disinterested. Their interests usually lie in providing a better life for their families, and not necessarily a specific economic system to do it. The syndicalists of the 20th century realized this, and that's why they usually fought for smaller things like higher wages and fewer work hours. But ideologically pure anarcho-communists seen this as focusing too much on the small picture as opposed to the real revolution at hand. Asking for small concessions forces you to work within the bourgeois system, and anarcho-communists want to abolish that system. Not to mention, according to G.P. Maximoff, one of the anarcho-syndicalists at the time, there was already a union of anarchists that were working within anarcho-syndicalism. The International Workingmen's Association, which according to him was the direct heir of the First International, continuing the work of Mikhail Bakunin himself. And the idea of introducing a new anarchist union was kind of seen as stepping on their turf. Some syndicalists seen their ideas as the leading ideas, a vanguard of ideas, if you will, and thought that their way was the best way. And they were more or less unwilling to give up that position. But with that being said, disregarding them, or the anarcho-syndicalist movement in general, removes one of the most potent weapons from the anarcho-communists' arsenal, the general strike. So clearly there were a lot, and I mean a lot, of different ideas floating around. This is only a small sampling of all of the different papers that were written on the topic, and it caused a major rift within the anarchist movement. Now, to analyze this accurately, or at least somewhat accurately, we're going to take a look at some of the pros and cons from all of these different positions. Starting with the synthesis method of unifying all of the different sects of anarchism under a general anti-authoritarian, anti-state line. Now, this loose unification causes many issues. In my personal opinion, it feels a bit wishy-washy. But most notably, if you're relying solely on the grounds of being anti-state, you end up with some pretty strange bedfellows. For instance, mutualists who consider themselves to be libertarian or anarchist also believe in a free market economy, as well as money. Making alliances with individuals who believe essentially in the tenets of capitalism, but not in the state, might be helpful in fighting the state, but not exactly helpful in fighting capitalism. Just like authoritarian communists and Bolsheviks believe in a centralized state, so allying with them for the purposes of defeating capitalism might be useful, but state socialists are notoriously useless at abolishing states. Again, I can see why Machno was trepidatious about aligning himself with half of the ideological spectrum while negating the other, considering he had just finished attempting several allegiances with the authoritarian Bolsheviks, who are ostensibly communist and presumably have the same desired end goal, but because of this difference in tactics, it resulted in having all of his friends shot in the head. Now, as far as the syndicalist unions are concerned, we know now from hindsight that using radical unionization is an important tactic, but only one of many that need to be implemented. Focusing primarily on unionizing while negating all of the other forms of radical activity narrows the scope too much and creates a hollow revolution. At the same time, in a workers' union, not every member is going to be politically educated, so ideological unity is going to take a back seat. Without the cohesiveness of beliefs and a shared desired outcome, these affiliations can become loosened and fall apart with political pressure or false promises from the bourgeoisie or owner class of a so-called better life that never actually comes. Nestor Machno understood this, and even outlined an entire section in his organizational platform based around the idea that anarcho-syndicalism is an essential part of the workers' struggle, but specified that these organizations are often led to chaos because they don't have ideological or political unity or a desired shared end goal. The thought was that if anarchist organizations could propagate their ideas within the syndicalist unions and make those ideas a unifying end goal, then we would have a much stronger chance of using the productive forces of the labor unions towards revolutionary purposes. And not through coercion, but through proving to them that anarchist ideas are useful and practical and realistic. Basically doing shit rather than talking about shit. So, here we have some incredibly important insights into two sides of a very important question. How do we as anarchists organize ourselves in a cohesive, efficient, and effective force while having brought enough appeal to gain popular support among our potential, albeit in some cases temporary, allies? And how do we resist getting stabbed in the back or having all of our friends shot in the head? The first issue is that without a broad base of alliances and a network of support, it's incredibly difficult to increase or even maintain large numbers. But the more you allow people with different economic, structural, and tactical ideas into the organization, the more it dilutes the actual goals of that organization. A large umbrella org attracts many people, but unfortunately, once those many people achieve their individual goals, they often tend to destroy each other, thanks to those ideological differences. I'm looking at you, authoritarian Bolsheviks. The truth is that in those situations, the better organized and tightly unified groups usually win. Now, taking this out of the context of history and into the modern day, we just suffered through a pandemic and an economic crash resulting in, according to the real unemployment numbers, over 20% of the American population being unemployed, and therefore unable to use their full power even if they are in an anarcho-syndicalist union. Not to mention the systemic eradication of unions in general for the last 100 years. This leaves a number of unemployed and class-unconscious people within local communities grasping for solutions without finding any within the current system. We also live in a fascinating time where even though our numbers are relatively small, our reach is incredibly vast thanks to the internet, even with all the censoring and repression. But this also brings cyber-geographic issues into the mix, because since a lot of our organizing is now done online with people across the world, we no longer share a relative history, culture, geography, or even people group. The only thing many online anarchists have in common is the social network they are using. We also don't necessarily face the same problems that synthesis anarchists did with anarcho-syndicalists, because anarcho-communists in general have more or less fully adopted class struggle into our praxis, looking at radical unionizing as an integral tool to building dual power. This is even something that most modern platformists agree with. On the same note, there really isn't a very large contingency of left-wing mutualists or individualist anarchists active in the real world today, specifically not doing praxis. The mutualists or libertarians that are usually tend to side more with right-wing fascist movements or the Boogaloo Boys, who even though they do have some left-leaning people within the group, have unclear intentions and a very mixed message. Currently, the most notable active left-wing political contingencies outside of the anarcho-communists are the Social Democrats DSA, Black Lives Matter groups, anti-colonialist projects, and a smattering of anti-fascist groups of a variety of political affiliations, many being Maoists surprisingly, but also Marxists and unaligned socialists. Even more surprisingly is that many Marxist or Marxist-Leninist thinkers and activists of today have fully adopted ideas of mutual aid, direct action, the general strike, and in some isolated cases, more democratic and decentralized organization, leaving the lines between us more and more fuzzy. Though if you talk to some terminally online leftists, they'll definitely tell you a very different story. But one thing that is clear is that the material conditions today are fundamentally different from that of the early 20th century. So that brings into question, what are some modern solutions? Well, mutual aid networks, having been adopted by almost every socialist and leftist group, are able to address these concerns and offer education on how to solve these problems through direct action, and, interestingly, are almost always made up of volunteers of many different political and ideological spectrums, often just good people looking for a way to help. But how does this work? How can normies without class consciousness operate in an anarchist or socialist way? Well, we know from experience in this field that a dedicated, ideologically unified, and deeply motivated core team is usually essential in operating mutual aid networks efficiently. This allows for a strong and focused organizational team to operate the project in an anarchistic way, while giving politically unconscious volunteers an opportunity to help themselves and their neighborhood while offering the basic education and understanding of essential democratic and anarchistic principles. And this isn't just a rebrand of Bolshevism. We have no illusion that we are the vanguard of the masses. This is literally just us starting organizations that help communities, and those communities, seeing the benefits, want to join. And we've actually seen what happens when they are operated by liberals. They almost always fall apart or resort to becoming charities immediately. Just look at my video, Never Let Liberals Lead. But this got me thinking that there might be some sort of relative solution to this division that may only be possible now that we have the ability to look back 100 years and to see how both of these contingencies played out. And in the spirit of a diversity of tactics, I believe that a synthesis between platformism and synthesism is necessary for a truly useful and highly organized anarchist federation at this time. Now, I'm going to go through what I came up with, and please feel free to correct anything I have wrong or give an alternative opinion in the comments section down below. So there are clear advantages to reaching a broad base and attracting large numbers, but having a strong organizational structure is really what wins wars. Considering this, we might want to organize our autonomous groups to accommodate both. How could we do this? Well, the organizational structure could be seen as a concentric circle with increasing political and ideological unity the closer you get to the center of each autonomous organization. The organization itself could take on a synthesis role toward political or strategic allies on the outermost circle, so long as those alliances don't violate our core beliefs. But also, tighter levels of organization, resembling a platformist structure, could make up the organizational and educational core. This would allow anarchist organizations to effectively erect dual power structures that rival the current economic system, while also inviting regular people and allies to participate. Of course, when we're talking about synthesis, we can't look at it in a 20th century perspective. We instead have to take into consideration the material conditions of today. And this, of course, would consist of left-wing anti-state actors, but also anti-fascist, anti-colonialist groups, environmental protection orgs, liberation movements, and that smattering of radical Marxists and socialists doing OTG work. I believe that this would allow for a broad-based coalition of comrades and political allies to work autonomously with one another in a unifying form without sacrificing individual liberty, identity, or ideology, while also operating at high levels of efficiency through the use of strong, tightly organized, unified organizational structures focusing on anarcho-communist and anarcho-syndicalist ideas at its base. Within these tighter formations, individual cells could operate cohesively with one another on a federated level following a democratically agreed upon platform. They could also make friendships, acquaintances, and strategic/political alliances with comrades, workers, neighbors, and community members within their respective geographic and cyber-geographic locations to attract a broad network and coalition. Since we live in a digital era, the digital realm must also be considered. Even though online activists can't align solely on geographic location, they can align on strategy, goals, or even activities. For instance, reading groups for education, agitprop groups for postering, doxing networks for fighting fascism, etc. But it should be important to keep in mind what the purpose of that group is, and not to broaden the scope too far. Some places should be social clubs, others need to be activist spaces, and we need to know the difference. These coalitions should be focused on revolutionary, anti-colonialist, anti-racist, and anti-fascist goals, as well as participating in or helping to construct mutual aid networks and dual power structures through direct action, while always considering the material conditions where you operate. The desired outcome of this is to 1. Form a dedicated base of motivated individuals to bring real-world anarcho-communist praxis and education to a broad base of allies. 2. Through education and action, we hope to convince our allies of the benefits of anarcho-communist principles and praxis, and eventually all unite under a unified platform. 3. We believe that a successful revolution will require that anarchist ideas become the leading ideas within the working class, and we know that this will not happen spontaneously. Our role is to make anarchist ideas the leading ideas, or, as it's sometimes expressed, to become a leadership of ideas. And 4. To present a working model of a better society and solution to the problems created by the system to the average person. This will in turn show the average person how a better society could be, with the hopes of motivating them into action or support. It should be our desire at this time to build the groundwork for larger, more cohesive organizations in the future. That requires numbers, but it also requires passion, skill, and a shared goal. We want to convince our allies today that anarcho-communist principles are practical, useful, and long-lasting in our modern era, and hopefully bring them to our side. But history has proven that if one day our means or goals diverge too far, it will lead to divisiveness, sectarianism, as well as brutality and bloodshed. And the lessons we've learned again and again is that the most organized and unified groups usually win. Anyway, that's the way I look at it, but I'm interested in hearing what you think. This is a great topic and incredibly deep, and I was only able to barely scratch the surface, so I'm sure that far smarter people have come up with much better arguments than mine, and please, like I said, leave them in the comment section down below, and as always, keep evolving.